There are approximately 0 individuals out there shopping for a camera and wondering whether they should pick up a medium format camera such as this one or an APS-C sensor camera, but I think that there might be a large group of people who might be curious. What does a 100 megapixel sensor camera image look like compared to a 26 megapixel one? What do Hasselblad colors look like compared to Sony colors? What is the medium format pop that everyone always talks about? Well, in this video, mostly to satisfy my own curiosity, I am comparing my A6700 to my Hasselblad CFV 100C and 907X, a $1,500 setup versus a roughly $11,000 setup. This video isn't sponsored, but Hasselblad did give me this camera to play with, and I'm not in denial that this is not a cheap camera setup at all. I'll do a follow-up video of my longer-term impressions of this vintage-inspired camera later on, but today what I wanted to do was just to see what the medium format 100 megapixel sensor gives you straight out of the camera. For this setup, I chose the XCD 90mm f2.5 lens, which is a piece of art. 90mm, after some extensive math, gives you roughly a 47mm equivalent on APS-C. So for comparison, it is going up against the Sigma 56mm f1.4, although not exactly the same, it is close enough, and I am adjusting the distance to my subject during the portraits to get that same focal length side by side. So let's get into the comparison. Sony a6700 and Sigma 56mm versus Hasselblad's 100 megapixel machine. Ready, set, go. I'll keep all of the Hasselblad images on the left and all the Sony images on the right. First thing that you notice is obviously 4x3 on the Sony sensor, 26 megapixel, and the sensor on the Hasselblad is significantly larger. It's almost a square sensor, and so you get more space up here, more space on the bottom, and so framing is a little bit more challenging as a result. Again, this is about 47 equivalent on APS-C, and this is a 56, but I tried to put my tripod further back on the APS-C setup just to give us the same exact perspective, or as close to the same perspective as possible. And so when you zoom in on the Hasselblad, that is what you get, and the same thing on the Sony. Now, I don't really care about sharpness. This comparison is not about the lenses. I'm not comparing the Sigma 56 to the 90mm XCD on the Hasselblad. Both are very sharp. However, I'm more curious about how the images overall render between the two. So here the Sony colors are warmer. The Hasselblad colors seem to be a lot more natural, and you'll see that in the majority of this comparison. I noticed it when I was just out taking these side-by-side photos. I noticed that the Hasselblad colors were simply way more natural and more correct. The white balance especially was better on the Hasselblad. Seeing this, I mean, this is a pretty close result, and you'll see the medium format f2.5, we're at f1.4 to kind of make up for the smaller sensor on the APS-C setup. So the bokeh actually looks pretty similar as well out here. I mean, it is remarkably close. Now, if we really want to zoom in and get more resolution, you can see that we can easily do that with the Sony. We could zoom in, but we do start to lose a lot of the details because the resolution is not as good. It's really a quarter of the resolution of the Hasselblad. So here is one nice thing I noticed about shooting medium format. Now, you notice that the background bokeh that you get is very similar between the two. So that's the first thing that I want to mention, is background separation is pretty even between the two images. But as I zoom in to both, you'll see that Janessa's face on the medium format camera is basically almost entirely in focus. You can see both eyes are pretty much in focus, whereas with the Sony, because we're shooting f1.4, only one of her eyes, actually in this case the further eye, is in focus. The one in front is out of focus. So the benefit here with medium format is, although you get the same background separation, you get your subject entirely, or at least the face entirely in focus, or nearly entirely, versus slightly out of focus, or one eye is out of focus with either a full frame or an APS-C camera. So that's a huge benefit, and obviously this is f2.5 versus f1.4, which has a lot to do with it. But you cannot get these sort of smooth backgrounds on an APS-C camera and also get the entire face in focus. So I'd say that's a nice benefit of shooting the larger format. If I shoot a random building, there is probably not going to be much of a difference here, but I do like the extra framing that that larger sensor gives me It makes for a unique kind of look, and obviously with 100 megapixels, that means you can crop this image into whatever you really want. I mean, look at the detail right up until, I mean, this is just incredible. You're at 200% right here. And then on the Sony, if I do the same thing and I try to, I mean, you can see pretty clearly you're at, I mean, 330%, and you're losing resolution already zooming in. So if you are someone who likes to crop in and you want the flexibility of taking basically a quarter of this image and just cropping it and still having excellent resolution equivalent to what you get with an APS-C sensor, there is something to say about medium format. So you'll see that the Sony has these kind of unpleasant greenish skin tones, and this is on the A6700, so this is really the best that they have. It's the newest color science, but I don't know what they're doing over at Hasselblad, but this is just really, really good. And I'll punch in just to give you guys a better idea. Let's a little bit more space there, 36%. So look at this side by side, and you guys can tell me down in the comments which one you think has better skin tones. I could tell you my preference is definitely the Hasselblad. I wish the Sony colors looked like this, but they don't. And this is a tough lighting situation where you have backlight, and you'll see that on both. Bokeh is very similar here. The subject separation between f1.4 on APS-C and f2.5 on medium format is surprisingly similar. Now, by the same token, I noticed that the Hasselblad would underexpose just a slight bit more than the Sony. The Sony typically overexposes all the time. I usually try to underexpose it by manually adjusting some things, but you'll see that this image here on the left is darker. This image on the right is significantly brighter. Here's another example of the Hasselblad being slightly underexposed, and I would say the Sony is probably a little bit overexposed in this one. So we'll zoom in, and both images look really quite remarkably good. There's something about that Hasselblad, I don't know what it is. It's pretty cool. f2.5, and you're getting these massive bokeh balls that you need f1.4 on the APS-C to get close to the same size. So pretty interesting. Here is another one, and I'm gonna punch in on both. Hopefully get you about the same. But what I noticed with this image is the blacks just look right, and you'll see just how much better the noise control is. In fact, I'm going to zoom in a lot more. So let's go into, let's say 240 something, 250%. So here I've zoomed into approximately the same image size, and hopefully you guys can see that, just how clean these dark areas are on the Hasselblad compared to the Sony APS-C. So this is not good. You get a lot of noise, some color fringing, and this is pretty remarkable. And this is ISO 64, ISO 100, so really the best that both cameras can do. That is really what you get with medium format, is the backgrounds are not only nice and separated, but if you zoom in, all of them look super duper clean compared to the equivalent field of view on a full frame or an APS-C camera. This is noisier with a lot of blotchy colors. You can see that here. This is just pretty incredible. Obviously, massive difference in resolution, and that shows when you are looking at details. People always talk about the 3D effect with medium format, where your subject kind of just stands out and looks like it's popping off of the image. And I can kind of see it. I don't know, maybe I'm just placeboing. I don't know what it is, but you can kind of see how this seems less flat than the image on the right. I don't know, maybe I'm just seeing weird things, but I'm curious what you guys think down in the comments. Skin tone rendering is pretty remarkably good on that Hasselblad. I'm not going to cover that up. Now, can you make the Sony image look like the Hasselblad in post? I think that you probably can with enough editing and some tweaks, but straight out of the camera, I'd say the images out of the Hasselblad are pretty remarkably good. Now, this is one where I really noticed the color difference between these two cameras setups. The Sony, as you can see, is not showing true whites. This is not white. This is some sort of beigey, yellow, very warm colors. This is almost like it's perfectly white balance, because this building is in fact white. This is really what we want, or at least what I would prefer out of my Sony. I wish that I could have auto white balance work as well on the Sony as it does on the Hasselblad, because getting a shot like this out of a Sony would be pretty remarkable. You can get it with tweaking your auto white balance settings and messing around with it, I'm sure. For this to be straight out of camera, really in auto mode or aperture priority mode, is a testament to the processing and the sensor on that Hasselblad. Now, the other thing that you'll notice here is as I zoom in, Janessa's out of focus. So not a big deal because high resolution, but we're not really comparing sharpness. But this is something that I wanted to mention because the Hasselblad and the Sony, both setups were on tripods. I tried my best to not shake them as I'm pressing the shutter button. The 907X does not have any built-in stabilization, but you can buy other Hasselblad cameras or other medium format cameras that do have stabilization built in. This just isn't one of them, so you do need to be quite stable or use a tripod to avoid those small camera shakes. It's a different process. It slows you down a little bit. With the Hasselblad, you kind of have to settle down, make sure the shot's there, make sure your subject's not moving, and then take the photo. But what an incredible image here. Even though it's out of focus, I mean, I take this one all day, every day over kind of the beigey, needs to be color corrected image that you get from the Sony. When you have a background that is pretty boring, there's not much of a difference. However, as I zoom in, you will see that there is in fact a difference. So the Sony, you could see, is already starting to fall apart. There's some haziness, pixelation. Hasselblad still has a ways to go. I mean, even zoomed in like this, I'd say it's falling apart at the same level right here. So that's pretty incredible. If I do the same thing on the Sony, I mean, you can see just how pixelated things get. So if you want, look at the eyeball. That's a good example. So look at the eyeball here and look at the eyeball here on the Sony. If I make it approximately the same size, and so you can actually see pixels here, whereas you can't really see pixels on the Hasselblad yet. So that is a pretty huge difference. Wow, look at that zoom. All the way in, all the way in. Yeah, pixelated. Still remarkably not pixelated. Here's another example of that perfect white balance that the Hasselblad pulls off compared to the Sony, which is yellowish, again, too warm. But I'm not going to zoom in that much, but I'll zoom in just like that, and then I'll zoom into the Sony. And I'd say this one too, I probably shook the Hasselblad a little bit because it's not looking as sharp. So you do have to be careful with that larger camera. It doesn't have stabilization again, whereas the Sony does have some stabilization, IBIS built in, depending on which camera body that you have. But looking at the overall image, if you look at the Hasselblad first, and then you look at the Sony, Hasselblad, Sony, I don't know if it's just me, but I do see that kind of 3D pop effect that everyone likes to talk about. This image from the Sony just looks a little more flat than this image from the Hasselblad, but let me know if I'm just being silly down in the comments. This will be the last one that we look at. By this point, it was getting pretty dark. You can't tell, but ISO values are pretty high. So I'm going to zoom in. The Hasselblad image, I think, yeah, it's slightly soft, possibly. Yeah, it's slightly maybe out of focus. But what's interesting here is the pixelation. So I'm not saying that the Hasselblad's perfect here, but you'll notice there's a lot of noise here with the Sony. And you'll notice it especially as you move out to these darker areas. So let me punch in even further to give you guys more of an idea. So like that. And then the Hasselblad, let's zoom into the same area and about there. So take a look at the difference in noise levels between 2500 ISO and 6400 ISO on the medium format sensor. That is pretty incredible. If you're working at night in the dark, that's a huge difference. You're able to recover so many more details in the dark versus this pixelation that you see on the smaller sensor. I mean, look at how smooth this is. It's somewhat pixelated, but really not that bad, versus this is just not that good on APS-C. Obviously, if you're not blowing up these images, if you're not zooming in, if you're not publishing this on a poster, you probably would never notice. But it is interesting to me looking at these two side by sides, especially in those dark areas, even on the subject. I mean, that is a pretty stark difference. This is still, even though it might be slightly out of focus, a very usable image at night at ISO 6400 on the Hasselblad versus at 2500 ISO. The APS-C sensor camera, even at f1.4, is falling apart at night. Alright, so the results will probably trigger two types of responses. First will be the group that has the APS-C cameras, and they are happy with how similar the images look, the sharpness, the bokeh, the similarities between a very expensive setup and a much more budget-friendly setup are not as dramatic in their eyes. The second group will notice these small improvements in color and noise levels and black levels and white balance and appreciate the results and the flexibility that medium format provides. This comparison to me is not about justifying the price of medium format or saying one is necessarily better than the other, but I've always wondered how much of a difference there was, and this comparison answered that for me. With medium format, what I've noticed is the balance that you get between having a subject's entire face in focus and still getting that subject separation and smooth blurry backgrounds at the exact same time. I think that is what the 3D pop effect is. It almost seems like at times that the image is a composition of a blurry backdrop and a sharp subject that is put together, like what your iPhone can fake in portrait mode. It's almost unrealistic, but this lens being f2.5 helps a little bit with that. The other thing that people always talk about is micro contrast, and I tried to see it. I was recently talking to my friend Manny Ortiz about micro contrast, and he was explaining it to me, and he said that once you see it, you can't unsee it. I told him then, jokingly but partially seriously, that I didn't want to see it because then I'd get even more picky with my images, and that just makes things more challenging. Ignorance is blissful, as they say. But I'm curious if you guys noticed the micro contrast. Let me know down in the comments below, and you can tag the time that you noticed a difference. My conclusion really is this: the 100 megapixel medium format sensor is a work of art. It really is. The resolution, the clean ISO values in darker areas, the color renditions, the skin tones. As a portrait setup, this gives you pretty incredible results. I could see this being the end game for a lot of people. Can you get better than 100 megapixels on a medium format sensor? I don't think so. Is it necessary? Absolutely not, but it is a piece of artistically engineered brilliance, and I can fully appreciate it for what it is. If you routinely print large photos, if you love cropping, if you want the crispiest of details, if you want flawless nighttime noise performance, this is about as good as it gets. But let me know what you guys think down in the comment section below. Were you surprised by the APS-C sensor performance? Were you expecting a different result? Should I abandon everything and only shoot medium format now? I always enjoy reading your guys' thoughts and the conversations that we have down below. So thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for more. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.